Where do the Miami Dolphins and their 2025 roster rank amongst their peers in the NFL? We're going to get into that here today on Locked On Dolphins.
You are Locked On Dolphins, your daily Miami Dolphins podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
All right, Miami, welcome to another episode of Locked On Dolphins. It is your team every day here on the Locked On Network. I'm your host, Kyle Krabs, a lifelong Miami Dolphins fan, host of Locked On Dolphins, co-host of Locked On NFL Scouting, author of Touchdown Miami on Substack, an NFL staff writer for A to Z Sports. Want to give a special welcome and shout out to our everydayers because it is your team every day. We don't just say it, we live it here on the Locked On Network. Today's episode of Locked On Dolphins is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app. Create an account and use code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off of your first purchase. Mentioned in the lead in today, co-host of the Locked On NFL Scouting podcast alongside Joe Marino, formerly of the Draft Dudes podcast. Formerly before that was Locked On NFL Scouting. So we've worn a lot of different hats on that show, but this is now year number 4 of us doing a content series that I'm going to take the results from and talk about them in depth for the Dolphins here today on the show. And each summer, you take 8 weeks. There's 8 divisions in the NFL, 4 teams. So Monday through Thursday for the last 8 weeks, Joe Marino and I have looked at every single roster across the NFL. And we've put every player into buckets like roster cornerstones, quality starters, sufficient level starters, replacement level starters, quality depth players, incomplete evaluations, players you don't really know which one of those buckets they fit in, rookies, and non-roster caliber players and practice squad caliber players. And we look at about the top 80 players on each roster. The objective being we want to identify the best that every roster has at their disposal from a player perspective, a talent perspective. How well has your team allocated talent and what resources from a skill perspective do they have at their disposal going into the year ahead? We put it into roster power rankings, and each one of those buckets has a numerical value that's associated with it. And then each one of those positions is weighted accordingly for how the league covets those positions to show a quarterback, and grading well there is more important than a right guard, as an example. Or maybe for the Dolphins, using right guard's a bad example based off of what's last season looked like. Maybe a Sam linebacker, because a lot of teams go 2 linebackers on the field. You get your Mike, who's the point man in the middle, and then you get the Will, who's away from the formational strength that can chase stuff down and play in space and so on and so forth. Maybe it's the Sam linebacker or strong safety, right? Your premium versus non-premium positions. And it gives you a really good idea of like what every team has to go to battle with this year. Well, we just finished the 8 weeks on Thursday of last week, just before the 4th of July. And that now has given us this weekend the chance to filter and stack and grade all of the results for all 32 teams. So we have these power rankings at our disposal as far as the rosters across the NFL. How well do they stack up? We're going to get into it and go bit by bit through the Dolphins here and explore how the Dolphins rank in each of these subcategories. We have quarterbacks, we have skill groups, we have offensive lines, we have defensive lines, we have linebackers, and we have defensive backs. We also have special teams. It's its own thing. And then there's a coaching element that we're not finished with yet. So like the total power rankings aren't done, but the actual roster got a pretty good snapshot of, and we're going to look at every one of those and how the Dolphins stack up. The Dolphins at quarterback, which I'm sure is exactly where you want to start. So Joe and I have to come to an agreement on the rankings of all of the players. We have Tua Tagovailoa down as a quality starting quarterback. Of course, the questions with Tua are less about what he's capable of doing and more about how frequently he's on the field and doing that. And that does show up in the rankings because he's in a bucket. We have probably, 10 quarterbacks that grade as roster cornerstones. And if you're not one of those 10, you're in the next bucket down, which is the quality starters. And it's kind of a coagulation of different quarterbacks at different junctures, right? Geno Smith's in this bucket. Brock Purdy's in this bucket. Tua's in this bucket. Dak Prescott, Jared Goff, Jordan Love in this bucket. You look at some younger guys. We have Kyler Murray and then Bo Nix and Trevor Lawrence and Sam Darnold are in this bucket right now. Based off what we know about this players, it's about 10 to 12 quarterbacks. But that top 10 is your cornerstone players. And then there's also a weight that's put into the backup quarterback as well. And it's kind of been a moving target for the Dolphins, and we don't really know because there's another new player in that spot with Zach Wilson. What I could tell you is the Dolphins are ranked tied for 14th for the entirety of their quarterback room. And I thought Brett Coleman had a really great thought on this. If you're not familiar with Brett talks about how on any given year, you kind of have like your 4 or 5 guys at the top, but then the rest of probably 6 through 18 in most years, the margins are so slim that like the guys that populate that back part of that, I don't want to say they're interchangeable, but they're very fluid and they change. And I think that's the part for the Dolphins where if you get 17 games of Tua Tagovailoa, you'd be ranked higher in this group than 14th because it puts less pressure on the backup quarterback. And we saw what that looked like last year. But when you're trying to rank him, and this is part of the conversation that Joe Marino and I had to kind of come to an agreement on the consensus of where was an appropriate value to rank, that conversation has to be a part of, well, how are you on the field? How often are you on the field? Are you always on the field? And because the answer is no for Tua, there's some quarterbacks that I think from a unique talent perspective that I think you can make arguments for that Tua at his best, you'd like to see in front of some of those players. But I don't think you can justify it based off of 10 games. And shout out to Tua for finishing 91st in the NFL 100 this year after missing 6 games this year, or whatever it was. It's a testament of what some of his peers think about him. But it's in that group, that tightly congested group, where if you can get stability throughout the course of a full season, I would rank it higher than where it ranks, which is tied for 14th out of all the rooms. And that, again, there is a part of that is included with backup quarterback play as well. As far as the skill group, the Dolphins are tied for 10th amongst all skill groups in the NFL. And I think you can look at some of the rooms that are out in front of the Dolphins in this exercise. And we already did something kind of like this when PFF put their rankings out for skill groups and who was really well represented. And some of the names are obvious, like Baltimore and Philadelphia and Minnesota. And the Indianapolis Colts are well regarded in this regard with what they have in Michael Pittman as a quality starter, but then Josh Downs is a really emergent player, and Jonathan Taylor as a more proven player than Devon Achane, even though Devon Achane is looking like a very productive receiver. The Colts also have Alec Pierce, A.D. Mitchell, the young guy. They've got Tyler Warren coming in at tight end, plus a couple of guys that had been productive role players where the Dolphins, you're looking at the top 4 wide receivers on the depth chart, the top 2 tight ends on the depth chart, and your top 2 running backs on the depth chart. So it's 8 players. The top 8 players is what gets scored. And then throughout the season, as injuries happen, you take a guy out if he's not playing, and you put the next guy up and you bump him up. And that changes their grade on a week-by-week basis. So I think it's a hard sell for the Dolphins to be much higher than this when you consider now the question mark that exists at tight end, where Darren Waller's an incomplete evaluation. We have no idea what he's going to be, right? So you can't realistically put a numerical value on a guy who you don't know. Maybe he comes in and he's a non-factor. Maybe he comes in and makes a bunch of mistakes but has to play, and that ends up being a minus influence on your team. He's a replacement level player. Maybe he comes in and plays well, and then he's a sufficient level starter. Like, it can go so many different ways. That's one that's hard to put in a bucket. It's hard to put Jalen Wright in a bucket right now. Obviously, you can't put Ollie Gordon in a bucket right now as a rookie. Malik Washington, how big of a role is he going to have? So when you look at like the clearly defined, established contributors for the Dolphins, It's your two of your three best guys are guys that are coming off down years in Jalen Waddle and Tyreek Hill. So as a result, the points scored is a little bit lighter. You've got some incomplete evaluations, and that's to be expected when you have a youth movement and you have more young guys that are coming in and trying to make their mark. So the Dolphins tied for 10th in the skill group. We're going to get into the offensive line, which I think is really, this is a really interesting group when you look at where some of the teams rank. We're going to get into that next, including this is the home of one of the biggest X factors for this scoring exercise and roster power rankings. One of the biggest X factors on the Dolphins roster lives in this group. We're going to get into that next here, Locked on Dolphins. Stick with us. The opportunity to get to the game is slowly creeping up on you. If you love catching the NFL action live and in person, Game Time can take the guesswork out of buying tickets for all of your favorite venues and events. And it's not just football. Perhaps there's some live music that you want to be out and partaking in with your friends. Summer is the great time for concerts. Game Time makes getting concert tickets faster and easier before prices usually drop the closer you get to showtime, so you can save up to 60% off with their killer last-minute deals. So if you're tired of endless scrolling, trying to find the best deal for whatever concert is coming to town, take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, use code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off of your first purchase. Terms to apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off. Download the Game Time app today. Last minute tickets with the lowest prices, guaranteed. So the offensive line, not a surprise. Dolphins don't rank in the top half of the league here. There's not a lot of argument for upward mobility, although the performance of one key player could be the key to a significantly improved ranking and standard at the time we get to the end of the season. This process, which looks at the top 7 offensive linemen on the depth chart, it's your 5 projected starters, your swing tackle, and your interior swing player, whoever that player is. Or your cornerstone, quality starter, sufficient level starter, replacement level starter, quality depth, et cetera, rookies, all the way down the list. The Dolphins rank 22nd in the NFL with our offensive line scoring. But James Daniels we have as a quality starter. Aaron Brewer we have as a quality starter who there was some consideration from a consensus standpoint of maybe bucketing him as a roster cornerstone. Austin Jackson we have as a sufficient level starter. Your utility players. You have Larry Borum, who is when projecting him into the scheme, Joe and I had the consensus that it's a quality depth player. Patrick Paul's the X factor because we have positional weights for player. Obviously, Jonah, as a rookie, Savaianaya, can do some damage in this regard as well, but he doesn't carry as much positional weight as a guard as what Patrick Paul at left tackle is. We have Patrick Paul in as an incomplete evaluation, where you had about 300 snaps. Some of them came at right tackle. Wouldn't be mad if we never saw Patrick Paul right tackle snaps ever again. But some of the left tackle stuff at the end of the season looked really promising. Now, how consistent is it? How high what floor does he set with his play? What's his ceiling with his play? Like, these are all questions, but because we have him as an incomplete evaluation, offensive tackle value with the weights is worth twice as much as an interior offensive lineman, because that's the league tells you with what their spending trends are that it's a more premium position. Now, we have seen and experienced and lived for the Dolphins the last couple of years. Your interior offensive lineman goes to hell. It's not going to be a fun experience. So there's still value. And for this process, the position groups, as far as these 6 buckets, quarterback, skill players, offensive line, defensive line, linebackers, and defensive backs, quarterbacks is the most points that you have at stake. And then it's tied with defensive and offensive lines. So this is technically tied for the second most valuable position in this entire thought exercise and data assessment that we have. And tackles within that second most valuable position group are worth twice as the interior players. And Pat's an incomplete evaluation. He's getting 0 points. If Pat comes in and even plays like a sufficient level starter, the Dolphins are going to bump names like Seattle, Jacksonville, who spent a bunch of money on offensive line, the Colts with Braden Smith, a little bit more towards the downturn of his career, and 2 new starters of unproven players on their interior. There's a number of teams that the Dolphins have the chance to jump that are right in front of them if Patrick Paul will come in and give you sufficient ranking, which would put them about the middle of the pack. And that, I think, is a better application in theory of what the Dolphins' past thought process has been. But then there's a lot of youth with these guys. Maybe they can grow together, and Patrick Paul really develops, and if Jonah really develops, and if Aaron Brewer continues to get better, you might wake up 12 months from now, we do this show, and be sitting here talking about how we got 3 quality starters on the Dolphins offensive line, and lo and behold, they might be comfortably in the top half of the league. At least you have that opportunity at your disposal, where you kind of knew what you had last year going in, and you're like, well, we're banking on continuity, and let's see how it goes. Nobody enjoyed watching how it went, right? So the Dolphins do rank 22nd, but it's the levels of unknown. And I think this has a chance as some of these players declare themselves into buckets. If you just perform at a certain baseline level, I think the entire health of this unit is going to be well represented by the end of the year. And that's one of the subplots that I'm excited to see how it plays out for the Dolphins. So the Dolphins offensively, 14th quarterback room in its entirety, tied for 10th with the skill group in its entirety. And then 22nd in the NFL with their offensive line, thanks to some incomplete evaluations, one at right guard with a rookie and one at left tackle, Patrick Paul, because of the positional value. One of the big X factors that awaits to declare themselves for the Dolphins this season. The defensive line. This is where the Dolphins are best represented. They are a top 5 unit when healthy on the defensive line. Zach Sieler is a cornerstone from a consensus perspective, along with Joe Marino. And remember, Joe's a Bills fan. So if there was ever going to be a great foil of where this roster is at, Joe's going to provide it, right? It's not just me arbitrarily putting players in buckets. There's a Bills fan who acts as the counterpoint and the other side of the coin for all these conversations. Phillips, Bradley Chubb, Chop Robinson, all currently quality starters. Chop, obviously an ascending player, takes another leap on the early down stuff this year. Probably going to end up being bucketed as a cornerstone. I think you could see either Bradley Chubb or Jalen Phillips play to that standard based on what they've looked like at their best, but you can't do it now. Chubb missed all of last year. Phillips missed, the last year and a half with the exception of 3.5 games. So 3 quality starters at edge. And we've Quentin Bell as a quality depth player. And you look at the top 8 players on the defensive line. Zach Sieler, cornerstone, Benito Jones as a quality depth player, and then the 2 rookies for the Dolphins. In first-round pick Kenneth Grant and fifth-round pick Jordan Phillips. You don't get those guys get 0 points. This is still a top 5 group with that because you got 3 quality starters and a cornerstone, along with 2 quality depth players. It's pretty deep. It's just you didn't have these guys last year, right? And you did lose Calais Campbell, obviously, and that is one that hurts. But it's right up there with the New York Giants, with Dexter Lawrence and Brian Burns and Abdul Carter and Kayvon Thibodeau. And it's up there with the Broncos, with John Franklin Myers and Zach Allen and Nick Benito. It's a well-represented group. Pittsburgh sits atop the charts here. And TJ Watt, Cam Hayward, first-round pick this year, and Derek Harmon, Keanu Benton, Nick Herbig. It's got Alex Highsmith. They got a great front. Pittsburgh's number 1 on the charts, but Dolphins top 5 in this group. Pretty well represented. So you take your average of your trenches, and one side's stronger than the other. And then you got a quarterback room that if it could stay healthy, if you get 17 games from the starter, it would rank higher than where it does. And skill players that's anchored by two guys coming off of lower seasons, but still ranks for a top 10 unit. If it was Jonnu Smith, it'd be a lot higher. I can tell you that, because the drop off from Jonnu Smith to an incomplete evaluation that's where that trade does hurt you for sure. We're not going to look forward to having the conversation about the secondary, but we will have the conversation around the secondary. But we have linebackers next. That's coming your way. Keep it locked in right here, Locked On Dolphins. Stick with us. Oh boy. The linebacker group looks at the top 4 linebackers on the depth chart. And I think that's where the Dolphins get a little bit of a leg up versus some of the competition here. Because this is a group that the Dolphins have a quality starter, or we perceive to be a quality starter, in Jordan Brooks. They have a sufficient level starter in Tyrell Dotson. And then the two guys behind him are quality depth players in both Willie Gay and KJ Brett. They're very role-specific kinds of players. There's a third down rush hybrid type player in Willie Gay, and then there's a plug, a downhill plug who can hit you like a ton of bricks that the Dolphins have in KJ Brett. But that's quality starter, sufficient level starter, quality depth. You see a lot of teams across the league that frankly just kind of thumb their nose at this position. Like Tampa Bay has an ageless wonder, really, at one of their linebacker spots with Levante David. But it's Anthony Walker, who was with the team last year and got phased out in favor of Tyrell Dodson. But then it's like Servachier Dennis is the next name on the list. You got names like the Raiders signed Jermaine Pratt after he was cut by the Bengals, and it's Elin and Robertson, Devin White in the year 2025. That's a sit down, you better sit down, hold your breath type situation. The Cardinals have Mac Wilson, Akeem Davis Gaither, and a 4th-round rookie in Cody Simon. Even the Ravens behind Roquan Smith is an unproven player, Trenton Simpson, Teddy Buchanan, and they brought a depth player over from the Rams to be the 4th linebacker. The Browns get a bad break because their best linebacker, JOK, is injured. It's Jordan Hicks, a rookie, Carson Swessinger, and then Jerome Baker. It's a decent group, but what is Swessinger? Right now, he's graded as a 0 because he's a rookie, right? The Rams, Omar Spates, Troy Reeder, Nate Landman. I mean, there's just a significant number of teams that aren't overly invested in this group. Now, there's some, and there's 3 linebacker rooms that we have, that we had 2 starters that were at least quality starters. The Jaguars with Devin Lloyd and Foye Olakun, the Jets with Quincy Williams and Jamian Sherwood, and the Commanders with Frankie Louvu and Bobby Wagner. Those 3 teams all had at least 2 quality starters. Remember, it's cornerstones, quality starters, sufficient starters. Most everybody finds at least 2 sufficient starters. Not all of them, but most of them do. And then you've got Dallas with Kenneth Murray, who we have as a replacement level player, and then a couple of quality depth players like Jack Sanborn and Damon Clark. Kansas City's well-rounded. They've got Nick Bolton, Drew Tranquill, and Leo Chenal. We have all 3 of those guys as quality starters. And it's pretty impressive. The Packers have that as well, and Edge Cooper's an ascending player who's probably going to end up being a sufficient starter before it's all said and done. The Dolphins, with this group, from a scoring perspective, they're tied with, because there's only 4 players in this position group, so it's a smaller bucket. They're tied with 9 teams for 8th place. So you could put them anywhere from 8th to 16th, and they all have the same grade because it all stacks out with a quality starter, a sufficient starter, and then 2 quality depth players behind it. So not a lot of separation from that group in that regard, but it's because of how small the player bucket is with only 4 players. The Houston Texans, shout out the Texans. They are the team that sits atop the charts in this regard. And you look at what Houston has. They've got a quality starter in Aziz Al-Shair, and then they have two other sufficient level starters with Christian Harris coming off of injury and EJ Speed, who they signed from Indianapolis, who we have as a sufficient level starter as well. So that's why I like doing this kind of thought exercise, to kind of sit down and you watch the film on all the players for a team, and you do it over an extended period of time, and you have these buckets to put the players in so it's not so overwhelming. So you're not just looking at a singular name and obsessing in a good way or a bad way about it. But if you've been obsessing about the Dolphins secondary, you're right to do so. Let's start there. A projected starting five right now in the secondary of Kader Kohou. I assume it's going to be Storm Duck and Artie Burns, as much as they'd like Cam Smith to do it. But Cam Smith and Storm Duck are both incomplete evaluations as far as what Cam's played 2 years and Storm's played more snaps than him in 2 years combined. And Storm played like 300 snaps last year. And like the Green Bay game was a really rough look for Storm Duck. So you have a sufficient level starter in Kader Kohou, and then you've got two incomplete evaluations plus a 10-year vet in Artie Burns, who hasn't played more than like 200 snaps in like 5 years. To go with. The good news is if you divide it and if you do corners by themselves, it's catastrophically bad. They don't rank last in secondary, but they're close. Thanks in large part to getting Minkah Fitzpatrick back as part of the trade. We grade him as a quality starter. We'll see if he can find some of that ball production and get back to that cornerstone status. But it's Minkah Fitzpatrick, quality starter, and then Ifeatu Melifonwu as a quality depth player, ideally, at the other safety spot. And then you have Ashton Davis, who's a quality depth player who's played meaningful ball and has found ball production, but has never seized a starting role as a full-time player. So you look at the safeties and it's like, man, like you could talk me into keeping 5-6 safeties if you had enough roster spots for all of them. I don't think they will. The Dolphins rank 30th in the NFL with the defensive back room combined with corners and safeties. So it looks at nickel, so 3 corners, 2 safeties, and then your third safety and your fourth corner. So it's 7 players that make up the grades. Dolphins snuck in front of the Raiders and the Jaguars, and that is it. The Raiders group, I remember them. They lost Trayvon Moehrig. They lost Nate Hobbs. They lost Jack Jones. They've had a massive exodus. Their secondary is Eric Stokes, former first-round flameout with the Packers, Jacorian Bennett, Darnay Holmes, career kind of depth linebacker, and then Isaiah Polomau and Jeremy Chin at the 2 safety spots. And then they have a replacement level safety in Lonnie Johnson and a third-round rookie in Darian Porter as the depth players in that group. So the good news is you don't have the worst secondary in the NFL, but you're close. Jacksonville is anchored by Tyson Campbell, who's regressed. Jordan Lewis coming over from Dallas. A couple of quality depth safeties in Darnell Savage and Eric Murray, and then Antonio Johnson is a day 3 draft choice who's still trying to find where his consistent floor is in the NFL. The Ravens very comfortably have the top spot in this regard. And it's not just because of Jair Alexander. The good news for the Dolphins is you can sign a sufficient level corner, and there's a few that are out there. We have Asante Samuel Jr. is in the sufficient starter bucket as an unsigned player. You have Rasul Douglas, who's still out there as a sufficient level starter. He's a sufficient starter graded player, but not with the team yet. And if you can add that player in place of one of those 2 corners that we talked about, the Dolphins will move to 29. So that might not move the needle for you a ton, but it does put you in front of at least another team when it's all said and done. So that's how the Dolphins stack up. Your fears in the secondary are affirmed. Your restrictions on the offensive side of the ball are due to the regression last year from your 2-star wide receivers, the availability of your quarterback, And then your big X factor players on either side of the ball, for me, are that to be determined corner, your your top two defensive tackles that are rookies, and Patrick Paul with the positional value and weight that he carries. If you get good returns in those three spots, this team will move up a couple spots in the ranking of where it's all said and done. Now, I don't want to reveal where exactly the team ranks versus the NFL from an entirety perspective, because we do that over on Locked On NFL Scouting, but I thought the weekend would be a good time to kind of go position room by position room for the 6 groups that we look at and just kind of talk a little bit about where these Dolphins stack up right now. That's going to do it for us here today on Locked On Dolphins. It is your team every day. Appreciate you guys as always for checking out the show. Make it a great rest of your day. I'll talk to you all again soon. Go Fins.